Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 35. My guest today is Dr. Anoop Kumar, and Dr. Kumar is a board-certified emergency physician. He's also an author. He's an author at the time of this recording of two books, Michelangelo's Medicine and Is This a Dream? And I will have links to discover those books down in the description field. He's also a mind-body strategist, and he is launching a new system or program, the podcast for this system and program will be launched on May 7th, and this is the year 2022 that this recording and this interview was made. And so on May 7th, he will be having conversations with people who have had actual healing occur. And so you'll understand more about why I hesitate on the word healing or why I emphasize the word healing if you dive into this conversation with us. So it was a brilliant conversation. Towards the end, we got into some of the metaphysics behind Anoop's work, and that was enjoyable if you like philosophy of mind and metaphysics as it relates to consciousness. We started in on that, and so I thank you for joining us in this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Anoop Kumar to the IdeaCast interview series, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As I was saying before we hit record, that I've spent the last few days just really intensively researching his work and watching a lot of his podcast interviews, and he's had some really neat guests on, people that deserve to be put out in platforms. So I've just appreciated the research period of this project and this process. So Anoop, welcome. Grateful to have you on the IdeaCast.
Thanks, Justin. It's great to be here.
Yes, it's good to have you here. And I would like to, I guess, in a traditional way, we'll start by learning just a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you to where you are in 2022.
That's a big question.
You can give us a thumbnail if you want. So, but yeah, I think it would be good to get a little bit of a background, because we're going to get into some pretty heavy duty stuff. So I want to see where you're coming from.
All right. So what I usually say is that I grew up in a philosophically minded household. My parents were very much into Advaita Vedanta, popularly called non-duality now. And that, I would say, was kind of my primary schooling.
Okay.
Obviously I was going to school concurrently, and I always felt like the school side of the knowledge was a much narrower path to kind of learning and understanding and experiencing than the other side that I was getting. But the two were obviously complementary. It's just that neither side spoke too much about how they actually bridge, so it was kind of these two separate fields of knowledge and trying to figure out, at least intellectually, how they come together. All of this was informally happening. I'm reflecting and just noting that this is what was happening as a child. So eventually I decided to go to medical school, ended up in medical school, did my training in emergency medicine, and started working in the ER. And as I was doing my training, this kind of incompleteness of the kind of scholastic educational approach really came to the forefront, really became unbearable not to talk about it anymore. And so that's when I started talking to, some of the people around me about it. Most people didn't really understand what I was saying. I was not saying what I wanted to say clearly. It's one of those things that's clear within oneself, but to articulate it is another story completely. So that was a process that lasted a few years. And eventually I saw that this whole idea of health and healthcare is something that is very poorly understood, right? So in emergency medicine, we're often putting out fires, so to speak, and the rest of the healthcare system, the idea in emergency medicine is that we help the person, we stabilize them, we get them moving in the right direction. And if they need further treatment in the hospital, they're admitted to the hospital, the other team takes over. When they leave, they go back, follow up with the primary care doctor. But nowhere was the actual cause of the fire being addressed. And neither did we have a framework to even think about causes of fires. And so that's when I said that, okay, it's very clear that we do not know what health is. And I don't think we know what care is as human beings, but as professionals, I'm not sure we know how to care, because I think if we don't know what health is, there's a question of, can we really care in the way we need to? So these questions became very prominent, and somehow or the other, I felt like I had to start talking about them. So over the last many years, then I've written a couple books and tried to address these things. And now it's all come to a head in the form of healthrevolution.org, which is this movement really to address these key questions in healthcare and to show, in fact, I think the most stark evidence you can see of some of the shortcomings we have, as well as the potential that we have, is to simply share stories of people who are healing despite the books saying, thou shalt not heal, right?
Yeah,
You are
right.
not supposed to heal.
Yeah.
No, rheumatoid arthritis is not supposed to heal unless you take immunosuppressants or steroids, right? Heart disease is not supposed to go away unless you are taking cholesterol medicine and stents. And by the way, that doesn't make the heart disease go away. That you just bypass it in a sense, right? But guess what? Human beings aren't reading the textbooks, and they are just healing. And there are so many cases of this. So that's how we're starting with the podcast and other programming. But essentially, all that education that I had is coming to bear here to investigate health, healing, what disease is, and human potential.
Okay. And to touch back on a couple things that you mentioned, you grew up in a philosophically oriented household and at Advaita Vedanta. So I'm thinking my limited knowledge would be Shankara and those teachings of, as opposed to something like Ramanuja, where it is more devotional. So was there aspects of devotional practice, or was it more just the inquiry into the Brahman and the non-dual state? So in other words, were they thinking in it more of a lens of empiricism, or more of the devotional aspect to the mystery? Just my curiosity, sorry.
Yeah. It's a fair question, important question. The Advaita Vedanta and the inquiry into Advaita tends to be Jnana Yoga based, which is the inquiry of the intellect. And the intellect is, it's not necessarily, like intellectual, like hard intellectualism. Intellect is that kind of, that simple, clear, direct apprehension. That's what's meant by intellect in this context. So Jnana Yoga is that process of refining the subtleties and movements of mind, and then reconciling, using concepts to climb that, but then ultimately discarding these concepts and just staying sensitized to these fine movements. So that was the primary way. And Shankara kind of really, I would say, crystallized Advaita, but of course it was there before him, long before him, thousands of years, in the form of the Upanishads and other people who were describing these things. So that was kind of the general approach, and it was within a larger context. Or there was devotional aspect was there, the service aspect was there. All of that was kind of a complete kind of picture.
Okay. And when you say Jnana Yoga, is that am I mishearing? Is it Ajnana skepticism? Is that what that is? The old school of skepticism that sort of emerged at a similar time to Advaita Vedanta? Or are you referencing something else completely?
No, but Jnana Yoga, I simply mean through intellect and understanding and progressively subtler levels of understanding, approaching what is more true. Okay.
I wanted to clarify for my own ears. I wasn't sure if I was hearing Ajnana skepticism, which is kind of an obscure school of skepticism. And my interest in that is that it went on to influence Greek philosophy, which I think is fascinating.
Okay, I'm not aware of that.
Sextus Empiricus, guys like that, the, Pyrrhonian skepticism. I only know that because I researched Pyrrhonian skepticism and I found Ajnana, and it's spelled with a J, so it's almost like Ajnana. But anyway, so I'm glad to clarify that because I want to make sure I'm understanding.
It might make sense because, I mean, jnana, a closed translation of jnana is knowledge.
Okay.
Right? So ajnana could be like the questioning of knowledge.
Okay.
Or the opposite, which could be skepticism. So that could be, I don't know for sure.
And it was somewhat of a heterodox system, and it was it fell out of favor. I think the more light side, the less rigid intellectual scathing inquiries were probably not as attractive to people. So, but anyway, it found itself in another existence again with the Greeks.
Okay.
And what I love about Pyrrhonian skepticism is it says that epoche leads to ataraxia, which is again part of kind of going back to the Advaita Vedanta, where if you just let go and suspension of judgment leads to that equanimity, that sense of grace, or however you want to call that. So
Yeah.
that's something I always find fun. Okay, so I'm sorry, I went on a tangent trying to just clarify a couple of things. Now let's get back up to Health Revolution, and you're working in medicine as a physician. When you talk to your peers and colleagues about this, what's the reception? What are you finding with folks in that field?
With most people working in healthcare, there is your kind of personal side and there's your professional side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the professional side of us is the side that's trained in the science and the philosophy actually too. It's not a formal training; it's a unspoken, implicit training. But that professional side often doesn't mesh completely with the personal side. For example, as on the personal side, all physicians know that people heal from things that the books say you cannot heal from.
Mm-hmm.
But on the professional side, we don't have the training to understand how that happens or why that happens.
Okay.
So when I'm speaking to another physician, for the most part, we're speaking as human beings. We're not speaking only as physicians. You know what I mean? Because we've had similar training, we share similar experiences, the ups and downs, all those kinds of things. So we might say, oh, wow, that's interesting. But once you go beyond that's interesting to say, how do we inquire into this? What are the mechanisms at play? How do we systematize this? At that point, most people will kind of drop out of the conversation because there's no professional training there. And also it challenges our training, right? In a way, it's kind of saying, we don't know. And that's, for some people that's hard because we're supposed to be the experts, right? And we have a lot of expertise in one area and we're missing a lot of expertise in another area. But that all falls under disease and health. So sometimes that's hard to, I think, face and look at. So there's this clear demarcation within the person, which is I'd say the personal side and the professional side.
Okay. And I would say it's safe to say that you're bringing Health Revolution on board and creating this podcast will be one element or aspect of this, hopefully a transformational process within, as you say, allopathic medicine and clinical medicine and the research that's behind it and the science that's delivering the most current information that physicians can work with. So, speaking of the big S science, there's going to have to be some paradigm shifts in that regard, I think, when the social sciences and medicine are relating to research science. I mean, it seems like there's going to have to be something on this side with research and the inquiry and the metaphysics, both before and after practicing science. That's just my general view of how this kind of shift would take place. But what are your insights on that, and so in other words, a materialistic physicalist presuppositions or dogmas even to open up to what may be now considered off limits in terms of mind and consciousness and all these things playing a role in all this. So what's your take on that?
So going back to what you said about hoping this kind of changes the medical system and let's say rounds out or completes the allopathic approach, the way that starts is with the public recognizing a couple things. One is that we don't really understand what health is. It's a very kind of plain and bald fact. We have a sense for it. Everybody has a sense for what it is to be healthy. But if we want to systematize that in society, we need to find ways to conceptualize and articulate that too, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make its way into curriculums, into systems, into ways of doing things. And so that's one thing. We need to understand that in healthcare now, there is no understanding of what health is. And let me just stop and say that again. As human beings in healthcare, I'm a human being in healthcare. I have a feeling for what it is. My colleagues have feelings for what it is. Professors have a feeling for what it is. But as part of the medical curriculum, there is no clear definition that we're agreeing on or goal for what health is, other than getting the blood pressure back to within a range, right?
Mm-hmm.
Taking the disease away. But that's not enough, because that's not tapping into enough of the human potential. So number one, we don't know what health is. Number two, people are healing from things all over the place that the books say they're not supposed to be healing from. So the revolution starts with people, the public all over the world saying, wait a second, we are doing things, we the people are doing things, namely healing, that is not understood in our system. Like, that should be crazy. That should be mind-blowing. That should not be happening. And if that's happening, we have to get to the bottom of that immediately, right? I mean, that's a fire. People are healing all over the place and we don't understand it, and we're just kind of putting it aside. Like, how many people are suffering then unnecessarily because of our unwillingness to face what we don't know, you know? So this ties into your second question about how this change happens. And it does start with this kind of metaphysics. It has to start there. It has to start with saying, wait a second, if we don't know what health really is, and if people are healing all over the place, then what are the assumptions that are in place right now, right? Let's test those assumptions. And the number one unexamined assumption in medical science today is that the body and the mind are different, and that the body produces the mind, specifically that the brain produces the mind.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never find this in a medical school textbook. You'll probably never hear a professor tell you this in medical school, but rest assured, all allopathic physicians are implicitly taught that the body creates the mind, that the brain creates the mind, right? That you alter neurotransmitters and then you affect the mind. But none of us, by virtue of our medical training, have been trained in philosophy, have been trained in inquiring into what mind is, right? For that matter, most psychology and psychiatry programs also do not inquire into, yes, we talk about mind, but what is the mind? Right. What are the ranges of the mind? How do different traditions who have written encyclopedias about the mind around the world describe mind? How do they investigate mind? How do they experience mind? How does that experience relate with the body and matter, and so on? None of this is included in our typical, what we call expert curricula. And so we have this default assumption that doesn't start in medical school, of course. It starts when you're born. It starts with our parents. It starts with elementary school, always focusing on the more, let's say, shareable linguistic aspects, which is what kind of body is, right? It's what we can kind of share and look at more easily, because as a culture, we're more attuned to that. And so that starts then, it gets solidified. And by the time you get to medical school, we start to think it's expertise based in science that the body is primary and mind is secondary, but it's all unexamined philosophical assumptions. Right. And so we need to bring that fact, let's say these facts. Number one, we don't know what health is. Number two, people are healing all over the place that supposedly should not be healing. And number three, we have an non-expert, unexamined assumption in medical school that the body is primary and creates the mind. We need to put a huge spotlight on these three facts. And that will be the beginning of a revolution. If we can make that spotlight bright enough, intense enough, hot enough, and that'll come from the public, such that we medical professionals have to answer to this, then we will start to see a revolution.
So to now bring in another facet of this scenario, or another aspect to this scenario, this is, in America, it's medicine is a market-driven system. Do you see one way or the other where parties involved, like insurance and the corporatization of the facilities that run medicine, Cleveland Clinic and places like that, do you see them incentivized to be sympathetic to this type of thinking for the sake of X? You know, what's their skin in this game on that? I think that probably not so much in other parts of the world, but I think here it's something that we have to factor in, I think.
Well, I think that if you have a system that is making money, which healthcare does, then they're going to be reluctant to change the assumptions that are making them money. It's, let's say, it's a part of human nature, I don't want to say all of human nature, but that's a part of human nature to be, if I'm making a lot of money doing this, then what's my incentive to really change that much? Yes, sad to say, but maybe millions more will heal over there. But if I feel divided from them and separate from them, and that's not me, then how much incentive do I really have? That is a fact of the matter. I was talking to Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn a couple of weeks ago. When we launched the podcast, he's one of the guests. He is a surgeon who became interested in heart disease and saw that if you go plant-based, then you can reverse heart disease. In fact, he has the angiograms to prove that people who had heart attacks, who were told they need stents, who were told they need bypass surgery, right? Heart bypass, cutting open the chest, taking the vessels apart, bypassing one vessel, and that way getting blood flow to the heart muscle that otherwise was not getting blood flow because of critical stenosis. They were told they need to do all this. And for one reason or the other, they started to try this diet and got amazing results. Now, it's a very particular diet, and you have to look into the details. I'm not speaking about this generally. You have to look into the details, but they got amazing results without stents, without surgery, and ultimately without medication. A few of them needed medication initially, and then they got off their medication too. And by the way, all the side effects were great. They felt clarity, they felt lighter. Many had other diagnoses resolved because of this diet as well, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Now, one thing I asked him, I was like, okay, this isn't really rocket science. There's studies on this. You switch your diet, you stay very particular. If you're able to stick with it, a lot of good things happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's been on I think it's the nutrition committee or something like that for the American College of Cardiology.
Okay.
I think he said for 10 years. And I asked him, I said, what are you doing on there for 10 years, right? I mean, he has a book and you can read it in a couple of days. And what more do you can look up a few studies, and then what more do you need? Like for 10 years, we're doing this, but the nutritional recommendation hasn't changed. I mean, you'll hear lip service, do this and it'll help, but how much do we really invest in that versus investing in communicating about cholesterol medicine and stents and cardiac bypass? Right. And why is that? And he said, I was reluctant to say this earlier in my career, but if heart disease goes away, what happens to procedures? What happens to the cholesterol medicine? What happens to the cardiologist, right? The definition of a cardiologist will change, especially interventional cardiology. And I'm not picking only on cardiology. It's all of us, all of our physicians that are dependent on our idea of disease. And by the way, that's one of the easier concepts, because all we're talking about is nutrition. That doesn't challenge physicalism, right? That doesn't challenge the idea that it is the body is first and the mind is second, for example.
Right.
But once you get beyond that, once you actually start to look at the physicalist idea itself, and that it is not really a science-supported idea, it's just a way of looking at things, then you're talking about a much bigger mountain. However, I do think that's what we have to look at. And I think it is by analyzing that we will start to learn how these people have started to heal, as you will see in the podcast.
Okay. And so a crude takeaway would be that reactive healthcare is probably going to stick around for a while, whereas proactive, as you were mentioning with the cardiac cases with plant-based medicine, is something that may be a task to be taken by the citizenry versus the market system. And so that sounds like a good way forward is to just have an informed public, an informed population that if they're willing to participate in that, in whatever modality, whether it's diet or whether it's less stress in your life or any of these other things that we're going to touch on, that just seems to make sense that you can bypass that. And so,
I would say just that I wouldn't cede the territory in saying that this is going to stick around for a while. I think we could change it tomorrow. And I think we have to look at it that way. So I'm not ready to cede that territory. Yes, I think it will start in the public, but remember that physicians are the public too.
Yeah.
There's nobody who's not the public, right? Executives are the public, right? CEOs of all the companies and med tech and pharma and health insurance and hospitals and all the trade groups, they're the public too. And guess what? they get disease too. And guess what? Their loved ones also get disease and die like all of us. And so this really speaks to that personal professional divide, right? I believe that everybody feels this, but what do we act on in our public life? What do we act on in our professional life? It's going to require courage. You know, we're going to have to look at people. We're going to have to look at people who are suffering and say, how do we actually best help them? Not just how do we conveniently help them? And so when I say it has to start in the public, I mean all of us, whether we're professionals or however we want to label ourselves. And, you know, there are many physicians who will hear this and know this is true. They will absolutely know that this is true. And it will be too hard to kind of, the question is, what do I do? How do we do something about this publicly? If you're feeling like that, contact me. Go to the website, healthrevolution.org, send me an email, and we'll start a conversation. I've talked to so many physicians that way who express so many things privately, but when you speak publicly, it's almost threatening your expertise. It's threatening your salary. And we need to find groups and places and communities where we can speak about these things safely and change.
Sure, sure. So I guess I was taking the cynical approach and seeing that the default plan B to a change of heart would be a change of market. And if this, and again, we are all the citizenry, just like there's no state, there's no, you know, there is a market system, there's a state system, but you know, I'm sorry for simplicity's sake that the citizenry and the patient public, you know, the people who can or cannot, may or may not have health issues, can make those informed choices, and that will steer the market. The market will trend just like politics trend by what you know, people think they think or think they believe or whatever in cultural issues. But just the same with anything that drives any market, it's in the demand. And so I think if the demand diminishes and people are following what you're working with, that could be a backup to what you're suggesting, which I think that's laudable, and I think that's very admirable, and I wish. And I want to be a part of that in terms of what I do to talking to people and so forth. But anyway, so it's just buying myself a little comfort that if the average, let's say the average public, not the people involved, not the stakeholders of the bigger cogs and wheels that can make this thing happen, if they start that turnaround, then those folks will see that and they'll follow it. And you know, there's always a way to make a living. There's always a way to be innovative. You know, I mean, we're a resourceful species, so I have faith that nobody will suffer a loss as a result of people being proactively healthy and doing some of the things that you and others are talking about. So anyway, I'm optimistic either way. But I like your idea and I like the approach, because I think that would be a beautiful cultural shift, or an amazing cultural shift, to see the medical field take note of this more proactive approach and dynamic approach. You know, different strategies and different practices and methodologies to make all of our lives better. So let's move to health revolution, because I think we've set up things pretty well to understand that there is a need for this, and there is an impetus for this to arise and take hold, and and again, it's relational. It's not like you have to tear something down completely. It's just that some things have to shift a little bit. So could you give us a insight into Health Revolution, both the podcast and the system that what you are proposing?
Yeah. So the whole idea of Health Revolution, like I said, begins with what I said earlier, those 3 points. And the question is, what do we do about it? And step one is always kind of declaring the state of things, understanding the state of things, and seeing that very clearly, because I think it's something, the solution is something that comes from all of us seeing this clearly, right? I think there's so many solutions out there. There's so many programs out there that you can enroll in, and people will get better. Dr. Esselstyn's program is a great example, right? By changing your food, by addressing stress, by exercising. There's so many things that we can do to start improving our health. And there are lots of programs out there. Why hasn't it reached critical mass? Why hasn't the healthcare system changed? Why are we still afraid of healing? Have you seen that? People are afraid of the word healing, especially professionals. When you start talking about healing, they back away. You know, you can talk about treatment, you can talk about less symptoms or fewer symptoms. But when you talk about healing, you'll never hear that word generally in the ER in the hospital. Well, this is gonna help you heal, or I'm gonna help you heal. No, I'm gonna treat you.
Yeah.
Right. And cure is also very minimally used because we're afraid of the word, right? What if it's not really a cure? So it's just remission, right? We can't say cure. Why are we afraid of healing and why are we afraid of cure? Obviously, we're afraid of our ignorance. We don't know what they are. So step one for Health Revolution is just presenting all this clearly, looking into what we mean by healing, looking into what is possible in healing, and looking into what is happening in society that is holding these things in place. I don't see a broad, clear, compelling, consistent conversation about this happening today. It has to be a steady drumbeat of clarity. And I don't see that happening today. So one is the evidence that you cannot refute, which is people are healing, right? They had the heart disease, they get an angiogram, they have no heart disease, their symptoms go away, and they just changed their food, right? They had rheumatoid arthritis, they started changing their food, they started doing meditation, looking into things, their rheumatoid arthritis disappeared, right? They had stage 4 metastatic cancer, they started to see some associations between their life before and what's happening now, and that disappeared. Now, I'm not saying this is a protocol that everyone can exactly copy. I'm not suggesting that everybody's going to be cured of these conditions, but I'm suggesting that many more can be if we look at these. So sharing these stories, and then we're going to start a live stream in which we start commenting on what may be happening, what are the mechanisms at play, and also responding to the questions and inquiries that people have, because it's going to bring up a lot of questions and a lot of confusion. Guess why? There's a lot of confusion in society because of our assumptions, and a lot of confusion in healthcare because of our assumptions. So it's the Jnana Yoga approach, right? That's how I grew up. It's this progressive clarifying of what is actually happening, what healing means, and what are the paths to get there. And then we're going to develop a program that people can enroll in based on the 4 engines. If you look across time at the things that have improved health, it's always 4 things. It's nutrition, it's movement, it's rest, and it's connection. And if there's something outside of these, anybody's hearing this, email me at healing@healthrevolution.org. Tell me what's outside of these 4, right? And this is not just the body. So nutrition is, what we're doing is nutrition, right? We're clarifying, we're understanding, we're asking questions. That's a big part of Health Revolution, is setting the stage, talking about what's happening. That's nutrition for the mind. Of course, nutrition for the body, right? We already talked about that with heart disease and many other conditions. Movement, yes, it's exercise. Yes, it's range of motion, but movement is also intellectual movement, creative movement, emotional movement, the emotions that I started to feel 20 years ago, but could never actually experience, that are lodged within me, are necessarily going to be still reverberating and affecting my thoughts, my moods, right? The choices I make, which are directly associated with the foods I eat, whether I actually move the body. Guess what that is? Health or disease, right? So it's not rocket science. Nutrition, movement, rest, obviously. Sleep is the obvious one, but also just knowing how to say, you know what? Just going to sit back for a while. I'm not going to do anything in particular, right? That's almost a skill nowadays. It's rare. Just being able to say, I'm just going to do nothing now until I feel like doing something, not for 30 minutes, not for 10 minutes, not for 2 hours, but till I feel like I need to do something, right? And connection, which is tripartite, connecting with others as we are doing now, connecting with ourselves, and connecting with the planet, which is bare feet in the soil, bare feet in the ocean, sunshine on the skin, rain on the skin, direct contact with the planet. If a society is doing these 4 things, and they're not easy, there are societal structures, there are ideas about work and career, there are ideas about money and economics in place that can make these difficult, that do make these difficult for many people, which is why we see so much disease. However, in terms of a solution, if we can enact these 4, we're going to see healing on a scale that we can't believe. We already know that 50% of chronic disease can be eradicated or can be prevented with what we call lifestyle changes. And that's just the surface of lifestyle, right? So we're going to be creating a program based on these 4 engines: nutrition, movement, rest, and connection, that people can enroll in, that can actually start to heal and reverse disease. So these are the 3 parts of Health Revolution now: the podcast, the live stream, which will be starting soon, and the healing program that people can enroll in.
Okay. And for the YouTube audience that's watching this, I will have all the information down below in the description field if you haven't already seen that. But just FYI, that'll be down there so that you can access all of this, because I support what you're doing. And I want to make sure that for the folks that I have in my stable, that they see this and that they can get involved, because I think it's certainly a worthy and important undertaking. And so in this process, will there be, or are there other parties aggregating some of the data on the spontaneous healing or remission or, health on the positive side? Is that a process that you see that's taking hold or emerging, or is that something you will have concomitant to the other systems that you have that you just described? Is that something that's going to be built into what you're doing? And are there other parties doing that?
So we are definitely going to be keeping data on our program and what is happening with that. There are other assessments. So one of the things we want to do is look into what is called spontaneous healing so much that it's no longer called spontaneous healing and it's just called healing, because now we understand it, right? Okay. Everything is spontaneous until we understand it, and then we kind of can see the cycle and how it happens. So the Institute of Noetic Sciences used to publish a volume called, I think it was called Spontaneous Remission or something. It was a big, thick volume of all kinds of cases of spontaneous healing. So they're doing that. There are many case reports. If you go through PubMed or other websites, you can find lots of articles on it. I'm talking to a couple experts who have written papers about cases. For example, there's at least, I think, 2 or 3 cases in the last couple of years when during the pandemic, someone had COVID-19 infection, and after that infection resolved, their advanced cancer went away, right? And so the idea is that perhaps this infection is stimulating the immune system and is causing it to go into overdrive, and it just destroys a cancer because it's so active, right? So now there are ideas about immunotherapy based on that. And there were some forms of that. There was something called Coley's toxins that was a few decades, maybe up to a century ago, I'm not sure. A person named Coley was actually introducing a toxin, I believe it was streptococci or some other kind of agent, into the bloodstream, intentionally causing infection as a way of causing regression of tumor. And he had some success. I think I got to look up the details. I don't remember, but some people said it works. And then they did subsequent studies and said, no, we can't reproduce it. And so ultimately it fell out of favor. But there's something to it, because we are seeing these cases where infection spurs on a healing or a regression of disease. So there are reports of this, there are volumes on it, and yes, we'll be keeping our own data as well. Okay.
And now I say this mostly out of ignorance, but it seems to me that one component that would need to be considered in this process is a complementary psychology presence of a practice. Again, it doesn't have to be anything blatantly psychologically, but just something there so the psyche, let's just use a very friendly term like the psyche, but the psyche in action, the psyche of history of, we all have our narrative histories. And so if there is trauma or injury in that narrative history, and we do enact those 4 processes that you're talking about, do those things sort of come along for the ride to be resolved, or where does the psyche get its moments with what you're proposing here?
So I think it's inevitable that when we hear these stories of healing, it forces a person, if they're curious about healing, to question what is the relationship between the mind and the body. It really forces the question. And I think one of the reasons we avoid that question, or we avoid the topic of healing, is because it forces the question.
Mm.
It forces, notice that we as a society, we've created a category called science, and another category called philosophy, and another category called religion.
Yeah.
And apparently these aren't compatible, right?
Yeah.
These are
Yeah.
totally strange. Never mind that we invented the categories with our own minds and our cultural assumptions and our ideas about what these are. We invented them, kept them separate, and now we're scared of the other categories. And we feel like they threaten our expertise, right? So what we're talking about when we're talking about these different categories are simply different ways of thinking, right? Different ways of approaching this topic of healing.
Okay. Okay.
So getting back to the question about mind, when this comes up, somebody's healing and they did it through, let's say, hypnosis. Let's say they did it through what will be called meditation. Let's say they did it through self-inquiry, right? Not strictly by that, but in addition to other factors that they're doing, it's also this. It's going to put this front and center, right? What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Right. And so the position that we take is that what we call the mind and the body are not different, right? So that's the fundamental hypothesis that we're working with. That though we like to say in healthcare, not explicitly, but implicitly through every action that we make, though we say that the brain creates the mind, though we say that we can treat the body and don't have to worry about the mind, right? Though all of our treatments that we prescribe are for the body, and right, even in cases of psychiatry, the prescriptions are for the brain and the neurotransmitter, right? It's treat that and the mind will be better is the idea. So though we say all this, we actually don't have a formalized understanding of mind or formalized relationship between body and mind. So we're putting one out there and we're positing that what we call mind and body are not fundamentally different. And there's this entire misunderstanding that has come because generally of ignorance in our culture and of a lack of curiosity and a lack of willingness to simply, frankly, read books. To put it quite simply, starting from elementary school, read books from other cultures that talk about the relationship between body and mind.
Right.
So that's why when we're angry, you can see it on a person's face, right? Anger is mind, facial expression is body. Somebody's happy, then you can see it on the face, right? Somebody is very excited, pupils dilate, heart rate goes up. So there's always this mind-body connection, and we're always wondering, what is this mind-body connection? It's very esoteric. It's very difficult to understand. No, well, what if there are no two such things? What if that this is just one unified experience and some denser aspects of it, some shared aspects of it we call body, some aspects that seem more private generally we call mind? That's fine. But this unified understanding of the human system as a whole, rather than just a body and perhaps something extra called the mind, that is what we're moving towards. And I believe that once we investigate that, clarify that, start to actually give that terms and work with that, we will start to see avenues of healing open up, because we're actually seeing more of the human being now, right? If you're just looking at the body, you're looking at a compartment. You're looking at the body. You're not looking at the human being. But if we look at the mind and everything that includes, right? That can include soul, that can include spirit, that can include intuition. It's basically a placeholder for the subtler experience of being human. And if we can include all of that, new avenues of healing will open up.
Okay. And it seems so intuitive to say mind body, whether you're coming at it from science as the neurocorrelates of consciousness and how certain neuropeptides affect, mood and behavior and even experience and things like that. But it's also at a street level, all of our sense apparatus are on our head, hearing, eyes, taste, smell, touch, everything is there. And so, and especially the eyes, right? If those of us that are gifted with vision, that it just seems so intuitive that this is the center, right? This is where everything is. And you had that a great conversation with, was it Christopher Nielsen? And he was a 3E guy. And I'm with you. I'm more like, I like the 4E cogsi, where, you have the embodied, the embedded rather, the enacted, and then the extended. And so it's, if you could take a much broader look at how mind, as we call it, the individual mind, is either manifests or expresses itself. It's way beyond corporal domain. So yeah,
it is. And also the sense organs, the biggest sense organ is the skin.
Mm-hmm.
And the skin is not localized to the head. In fact,
Right.
most of the skin is not on the head, right?
Yeah.
And the skin is one of the most, I mean, that's how our reflexes are based on skin,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I can touch something and before I know it's hot, my hand is already off of it.
Yeah.
Because, so we could even say that moving away from the head, you actually get towards the more, I don't know, let's say the more primary or the most fundamental aspects of sensation.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course, you know, how we feel each other in a room, how you walk into a room and you can sense the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
What sense organ, so to speak, is that?
Yeah.
And when we start looking at these things, we start to see that what we call biology and what we call physicality is a pattern of being.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of being. It's not the only way that we can be, right? And again, this forces us to take down the walls between science, philosophy, religion, spirituality, all of these things. Which walls? The walls that we ourselves invented. Let's not forget that. Yeah. Nobody created these walls except us.
Yeah.
And now we are locked within those walls and we are threatened by those walls. Guess what we should do?
Yeah.
Take them down.
Right. A false dilemma was created. Yeah. And I'm inspired by what information theorists, I don't dive deep in that pool, but the information theorists will tell you, and other disciplines will say this same kind of postulation, that our sense organs bring in 10 million bits of information per second, and that we only on the screen of perception will process 40 to 120 of those bits. So when we talk about going into the room and reading something, that, you know, we have this symphony of sense perception, but that it's obviously filtered down so that when, you know, our brains don't blow up or whatever might happen if we took all 10 million. But I like that idea that, like, you walk in a room and your salience is much broader than what you can react to. So like you see a bookshelf, your brain automatically reads every title of that. I assume would already see every title of that book. You just can't access it. So there's latitude there in terms of what the holistic sense of mind, as at least brought to us by sense organs, we have to give a lot more credit to to what's going on there. But I always love that huge discrepancy between 10 million bits of information that are available and the 40 to 120 bits that we are working with. Yeah, there's a huge difference there.
Well, and I think it's important to say that I think most people would agree that on a daily level, we human beings are capable of so much, right? Even a simple example, like you said, about information processing, right? Mm-hmm. And when we see people doing extraordinary things, we know that in all of us, there is some innate potential to do things that we consider amazing or supernatural, right?
Yeah.
So why doesn't that happen? And by the way, all of us experience this. Everybody's had an experience where we're like, oh, you know, how did I know that? Or you walk into a room and you sense all of these things, but we don't have words for it. So we don't pay attention to it because we haven't languaged it, right? We don't talk about it in general society because we haven't languaged it and we're not sensitized to accept that, right? The sensitivity is kind of concretized within this body because the constant bombardment is body, right? Our parents, when we were kids, said, these are your eyes, this is your nose, this is your mouth, this is your elbow. And when you got to name these things, they got really happy, right? Like, wow. And then what we're learning, what they're saying essentially is, this is you, this is you, this is you, this is you, this is you. And they start connecting the sense of I, the word I, the sense of me, the elbow, the stomach, the head, you know, all of this starts to coalesce and coagulate. And now comes this identity. Oh, okay, I am this body. Never mind that they had imaginary friends, that they could feel other people's emotions, that all kinds of those things now get squeezed and concretized within the body. And now this person becomes a person who's inquiring and wants to understand the world and all of these things, right? But we have that innate potential. We have to language it. We have to describe it. And more than anything else, we have to resensitize ourselves, because what happens is all the adults have said, that's not important in a way, right? The way you get your degree, the way you get your salary, the way you get all these things is by leaving all those things out. And so fundamentally, Justin, that is actually what's at play here. When we talk about this mind-body divide and professionals and experts, it's not about intellectual understanding. It's about this acceptance that's been given to this person because of them limiting their own perception and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And for them to delimit themselves, they will have to give up that acceptance, which has been layered from parents to peers to professionals to their own patients. So that's really what we're talking about. And on the surface, it's all of this intellectual stuff.
Right. So then that presents a question about how do we sort of unlock ourselves from this purely corporal agency to be a more dynamic agency, or the aspectual agency, or the aspect of the agency is magnified. We can reverse engineer or reverse experience, learn that, I guess. And are there folks working on that, or what are your thoughts on the process to bring us to rechild ourselves, I guess, or reimagine ourselves as imaginative people?
Yeah. I think I'll give a very simple one that I think is the most effective technique in the world. And it's simply association and relationship. Like, be in association with people that you feel are this way. Honestly,
Okay.
it's so simple. I'm not saying it's even easy. I was going to say it's not easy, but it is easy if you can just spend time with them, be in association with them. This in the Indian tradition, it's called satsang, right? Satsang is this word where sangha is like community, or like relationship community, and sat is existence or truth or what is real. Mm-hmm. So it's simply being in community with what is real and what is true, right? Spend time with those people. And there is no more effective way. Now, there are many things. There are introspective techniques, all the 4 engines: nutrition, movement, rest, connection. I'm specifically talking about connection with others now when I'm talking about this. But when everything else is difficult, when everything else is impossible, this association has an effect, right? Because if this world is interconnected, if there is some commonality to this whole universe, then maybe we can play upon that resonance. That's one way to look at it. Mm-hmm. So I would say that is the simplest way.
And I love the simplicity in that. And I think, given that we are social animals, social creatures, that I hold to I like the idea that on one end of this spectrum, as social creatures, that we can almost live vicariously through people if we're not in sort of this governing of ourselves. But if you ratchet that back down a little bit, that we as social creatures, as humans that evolved tribally, that we live with others, like you just said, and by the exposure, it's almost a mimetic process. The language and the introjection of ideas and things like that are very influential. You hear thought viruses going around on social media where they're like, not so much, or these little phrase words come up all the time. And so we're very, very viral, socially viral. I call it stigmergy, like a social stigmergy. Like ants follow pheromone trails, we follow social cues and things like that. So I totally agree that if you latch on to influencing compatriots or people within your system, that absolutely that can have a huge effect.
And what this does is that in this kind of community, it's a community where a person is allowed to experience those aspects of themselves without fear of being shut down, right? So like, if I have to be a particular way so that the world accepts me, that then resonates back to childhood, back to teachers, back to training, back to, all those things are touched upon every time we're in any kind of situation. Now you're in a different kind of situation where everybody's kind of exploring these more sensitized aspects, these finer aspects, these subtle aspects, these child aspects, we can say, right? Child, not in terms of immaturity, child in terms of a lack of walls before we built the walls, right?
Yeah.
So if everybody's doing that, now there's a certain freedom and an expansion that opens up. And it's not by virtue of anybody doing anything. It's just the natural human potential and tendency is allowed to flower.
Absolutely. That's beautifully well said. So with Health Revolution, what are you even seeing? Are you visioning a future? What kind of growth and forward progress are you seeing for this? Can I call it an organization, or what's the
Yeah,
right term? Okay, so where would you like to see this? I like to imagine.
yeah,
I like to think forward. I don't predict and model anything per se. So where is your
yeah,
vision with this? So, I mean, are you looking at little micro communities popping up that support one another based on the
yeah,
centrality of the work, and then how do you
yeah.
see that moving forward to
I do see that.
okay.
So let's vision this out. So I see the live stream reaching a large number of people. I see the live stream also being this, as we do this clarity, as we offer this clarity, which is bi-directional, by the way, right?
Mhm.
We're getting people's thoughts and feelings, and we're putting out our own thoughts and feelings. And as this happens, this message becomes more and more relevant because it's directly responding to the needs of the people. It becomes more and more popular. And with every live stream, we also are doing a meditation at the end, right?
Mhm.
And what is this meditation? It's basically a healing space,
Mhm.
right? What is a healing space? It's a space where everyone understands that healing is possible. Whatever healing means to you, healing is possible,
Mhm.
right? We're open to that possibility. There's no space in society today where you can go and that's what it feels like. People are afraid of even the word, let alone the possibility that it could happen, right? And we're talking about well-intentioned people who want to
Mhm.
help people. But
Right.
again, it's not about our intellect, it's about our upbringing. These are like entrenched tendencies. In this space, healing is possible. And I see hundreds of thousands of people eventually joining these live streams, right? And imagine when you have that many people who simply say, yeah, I don't know, but guess what? I think healing is possible.
Mhm. Mhm.
That is an entirely different space. There's no space like that in society today.
Yeah.
That's one thing I see happening. Another thing is a center for healing and understanding, right? Like a property somewhere by the water, and we build this, it's almost like a campus,
Mhm.
but the heart of it is this center where we talk about anatomy from the cosmic to the particulate scale.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is right now we think of a human being as a human body. And that is the fatal flaw in our model of human anatomy today. We think anatomy is body. No, anatomy is supposed to be a map of the human being. That's what
Mhm.
anatomy is.
Mhm.
And if you look at anatomy textbooks over the years, guess what? They've changed,
Mhm.
right? As they should. As our understanding and vision evolves, so should our models of anatomy. If you look at Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and allopathy, you'll get three different models of anatomy. We can't say anyone is right or wrong. There are three
Mhm.
different visions of what the human being is. And if one's mind is not trained a particular way, we won't have the other vision. So we need to correct this fatal flaw with a complete model of human anatomy that includes mind. And I told you before, mind is an expansive word that includes everything. Where's the boundary of the mind, really? Right?
Mhm.
You can go
Mhm.
to Pluto in your mind now, right? You can go to the bottom of the Pacific in your mind now. So what we're seeing, the other thing is the boundary of the human being, to follow up on this idea of anatomy.
Mhm.
We would say that we have this outline here, but the more you zoom in on this outline, the more it disappears, right? We see a line of skin. Well, no, if you zoom in, you'll actually see cells, right? Skin
Mhm.
cells. If you
Okay.
zoom into the skin cell, well, that line goes, now you're talking about molecules. That goes, you're talking about subatomic particles. That goes, and you're getting into fields that extend throughout space. So where the
Yeah.
heck is this line
Yeah.
that of the human body?
Yeah.
How do we get this idea that human anatomy ends at the skin when we cannot find that boundary?
Mhm.
It's a kind of insanity that comes from a lack of vision and a lack of sensitivity, a lack of curiosity, and a lack of understanding. And in some fields, maybe it's excusable, it's inexcusable in health because
Mhm.
people suffer because of that, right? So if we want a complete model of human anatomy, we have to include mind, and we have to see that the environment is like our anatomy,
Mhm.
right? If the trees are not there, how are we breathing? Right? If the oxygen is not there, how are we breathing? If the
Right.
rivers and oceans aren't there, where is our water that becomes our bloodstream? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so this complete model of human anatomy I see from the cosmic scale, from talking about the Big Bang down through galaxies and solar systems and planets and nations and communities, and then the individuals, then the body, and then down to organ systems, organs, cells, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, elementary particles, waves, fields, space and time, and then what is beyond space and time that we have yet to identify, but connects back again with the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cycle of anatomy, and we have to see ourselves as cycles, right? So this is the foundational idea of the Center for Healing and Understanding, that we are interconnected, vast beings. And from there, we put in the principles of Ayurveda, of Chinese medicine, of allopathy, all of which are useful from their own perspective, right? And we create this complete map of health and healing and disease that transcends, or that breaks down the barriers of mind and matter, of religion and philosophy, of science and spirituality, that we say, you know what, we don't care for these boundaries. What we care about is healing and understanding. And so that will be the goal in this Center for Healing and Understanding. We'll develop programs for healing based on this understanding. And it will be a place where it'll be an oasis where people can just come and just say, I needed this. I needed these 2 weeks, and I'm leaving a new person. Right? So that's part of it. I told you about the live stream and then this program. There are many ways to think about the actual program, because not everyone can come to the center, right? So we want to make it accessible to everybody based on the 4 engines. And maybe we'll do a 4-week program to give a taste of healing based on these 4 engines: nutrition, movement, rest, and connection. 1 week each. We introduce the ideas, we develop the practice, we develop a community where we do it together, right? The hard thing about this is actually doing it, right? It's not rocket science. Like I said, there are tons of programs out there, but why hasn't it reached scale? Because that support isn't there, and that audacity to do this on a huge scale and to actually challenge the metaphysics and the ignorance that is in healthcare now, that audacity isn't there, right? So that combination plus the community support, where we really give support along with medical knowledge to help people through this, right? And the idea is that if you change these aspects, nutrition, movement, rest, connection, which we will do because of the community support and the encouragement, it's almost like taking advantage of mob mentality, right? We're using mob mentality in a good way, that we're all kind of getting together doing this. And if we do all this, within 4 weeks, people will start to experience some experience of healing. And we want to just offer that taste and enroll new people every month and just get through, what is it, like 4 billion people in the world that have some kind of chronic condition. So that's the goal. Let's reach 4 billion people.
Right.
So that's my early vision for you, Justin.
I love it. And you brought it up you scaled it appropriately too, I think. Because that's my biggest concern, that as you said a moment ago, there are a million self-help guru types out there but they end up becoming either for-profit industries or they end up becoming cults. And those 2 options are untenable when it comes to what the original, and I don't fault the people behind it because their intentions were good, but I've been orbiting this kind of thing for 30 something years, and I see what happens sometimes. People get swept up in the inertia of projection and archetypal projection, like, savior figures and things like that, which is again where things just go off in their own eddies. And I'm not trying to editorialize too much, but what needs to be brought into the fold, I think, is a democratization where there are checks and balances, and there are decentralized systems or organizational apparati or whatever, that manage that. And so that because people are people, and we said this earlier, it's very easy to attach to someone if you see that they're doing well, or that they are the one that overcame something. And again, these are all caveats that I've seen in the years that I've been doing things. So
so let me just mention something there that's really important. One, quickly before I forget, I'd like to check back with you every so often, and I'd like you to hold me to that. And check me and say, hey, what about this? What about that? So I would appreciate that. Number 2, In terms of decentralization, with healing spaces, this healing space, this virtual space, we're going to create. But then what I would like to happen is that people start to say, well, this is really simple. We can create a healing space where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would love to have healing spaces like all over, a healing space. Sydney is a healing space, Calcutta is a healing space. Washington, D.C. is a healing space. St. Louis is a healing space. And people just creating, and what you do is simply get together, understand some of the limitations in thinking very simply that are prevalent in society and healthcare, and simply say, when we look at these and when we look at the evidence of people healing is possible. And just sit in that, be in that space where there's clarity and possibility of healing. That's all a healing space is. And I feel that that's very powerful. And the more little centers we have, whether it's 2 people or 200,000 people, the more they will start to coalesce. These kind of nodes will coalesce. Sure. And the final thing I wanted to say about that is this aspect of dependence. It's very well understood in, I only know the kind of the Indian tradition, right? The Vedanta tradition of guru shishya and teacher student kind of relationship.
Right.
The awesome aspect of what I said about simply spending time with people that who kind of get it is that you start to imbibe that possibility, and you start to see how they think, and you can kind of see, and you can kind of inquire on your own and develop that kind of vision that works for you, right? And the downside of that is you become dependent on this person at the same time. Yeah. And so it's very well known in these traditions that there is a point where the teacher says, like, go off, make it your own knowledge, do what you got to do. You've had enough. Don't just hang around forever, right? That's such a key part of that process. And so, and that's why you have so many different kind of ways of interpreting and talking and everything. So those things came up in my mind, but I would ask a favor if you can, because one of the things we're going to do is we feel we have to make a profit to sustain this company, to do this in a way. We want to show what a business really is, that you can actually serve a deep need. You can serve it in a profound way, and you can do very well with it and reinvest a ton of money into scaling it like crazy. And that's what we want to do. Yeah. So I would ask for a favor from you to hold us to all those things, maybe every year or so we can check in.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm doing the same thing in the sense that my project, and I probably should have, we can talk about this later, but I have a project called Illumine Life. And it's something, there's a little bit of a paywall on the website right now, but my work is complementary to what you're doing in the sense that I'm bracketing one little thing very narrowly, and it is the concept of the self and identity, and ego ties in a little bit, but it's asking people to launch this eternal inquiry about self and relationship with the world, self as what is self, all these kind of questions that could then in turn translate over to the work that you guys are doing and you're doing. And it would be a nice handoff, but that's what I've chosen to take on, is getting people started on the inquiry, because I think a lot of us are lost in persona. A lot of us are lost in ego. A lot of us don't know who we are. A lot of us, and we suffer for that. We suffer tremendously when we play this character that's not really us. And I have this other idea of the being, strictly just being, not the physical being, but it's like when a computer's not taking any information in and it's not attached to the internet, it's just a machine running. And so that's a really crude analogy, but there's just this raw being. And that's basically the oneness of meditation. When you get into that non-dual state of meditation, I'm alluding to that to an extent, but more in a functional sense. So what we're doing, they parallel, but that's my roadmap for myself, is if anybody pays attention to any of this stuff that I'm trying to do, that it's as quickly as can be possible, decentralized, multiple facilitation with good faith actors, good faith people, based on just some simple core tenets. It cannot be turned into something that is over intellectualized. It cannot be polluted in that sense that, people will spin off and put their own versions on it, like we've seen with religion. Like, Christianity has multiple different sects and denominations and stuff, and so that's a big example of that kind of thinking. And that the transference, like you said a moment ago, in psychotherapy, a lot of times the patient will bond to the caregiver, to the provider, the psychologist or the psychotherapist, and that transference is a real problem. And like you were just saying with the master and the student, go on and take this and move with it. So yeah, absolutely, I do want to be in each other's orbit going forward, because this is exactly what I'm doing, but it's not so much physical health. It is just one facet that can contribute to that. So yeah, we'll stay in touch on that. Can we start talking metaphysics a little bit? Let's broaden the lens out and get where you're coming from and where essentially I'm coming from as well. And I love your three minds proposition and your system. And so let's talk about that. Let me steel man it to you, and then you can correct me. And I'll steel man it for the sake of the audience. And so I see the third mind as being this sort of spatiotemporally unbound enigma of, the core ontology, the primitive of whatever it is, or whatever is. And then the second mind would be more of that which we relate to, that which we would call the world at large, physicality. Schopenhauer called it representation. And that the first mind is, albeit you could almost say illusory, it is the sense of individuality, it is the functionality as it relates to the world at large. It is our agency, it is our experiential apparatus. So is that a decent steel man, or do you need to tune that up a little bit?
I'll tune it, just because I think this is a finer level of discussion here than I might speak about usually. So I'll tune it to say that the second mind is a range which extends. Well, let's start with the first mind. The first mind is simply the experience of definite boundaries. All right. So a human being experiences the first mind as the experience that I am this body, or I am this mind, I am this personality. And it's very clear what this is and what I am, and what that is and what he is, right? That's very clear to me. And along with that, not coincidentally, is I'm very clear that I'm looking at a camera now that has definite boundaries. I'm very clear that there's a floor beneath my feet, and then there's a desk over there, and there's so many things around me. And if I walk and explore the world, there will be infinite things that I can experience. This is all very clear to me as a first mind, right?
Okay.
What does that mean? The implication in the three minds framework is that the reason that we are experiencing this universe and this world in this way is because the sense of identity itself has localized. The extent to which the sense of identity localizes and becomes discrete is the extent to which we experience this world as a series of infinite localized things that are discrete, right? So this challenges the realist idea, and frankly, just the implicit idea in the world, including in medical training, that the world out there is an independent, external, physical world that has nothing to do with me, right? At a potential level, that can be true. It has nothing to do with me as an individual per se, but everything that we experience as things is dependent on our own identity. And the extent to which we experience our identities localized is why we experience the world as things. In other words, the world is fundamentally of a potential nature, and depending on how the identity coalesces, the world is accessed or interpreted at that level. Simple example is, if I put on pink shades, pink sunglasses, the world appears pink. Everything appears pink. And I can do all the randomized control trials I want. I can do all the studies I want. I can harness all the MDs and PhDs and get together in a stuffy room and think about it all I want. And guess what they'll say? We have concluded definitively, based on all the studies and the expertise, we know for sure the world is pink. You know why? Because they never touched their eyes and, whoa, what is this? Took it off. Holy cow.
Yeah, right.
There's this range of colors, right? So to understand that even our science and our philosophy is based on the lens of identity is something that comes only with experience, with experiencing the changing nature and ranges of identity, right? So that's the first mind. The second mind then is the range where the experience is that one's identity is more of a potential nature. That what I am fundamentally, not intellectually, but experientially, what this word I points to, what this word I correlates to, what this word I is smeared all over is this potentiality. And it is this potentiality which differentiates and crystallizes as the subject-object relationship, as the individual seeing a thing, as Anoop and Justin, right? And so this series of dualistic relationships is the fundamental building block of the world. Experiences are the building block of the world, not particles, not fields, right? We don't really know what fields are, but as we get into that, it's experiences that make up the world. And when we look at them partially and only at the objective pole, we think they are things. So the second mind experience, again, is the experience that this I correlates with a non-local potentiality. And it is this non-local potentiality, we can say waving or wafting up, that we experience as physicality and discrete boundaries. So to address how you commented on it earlier, the deep second mind is beyond space-time already.
Okay.
The deep second mind is what, let's say, perturbs or what thrills as the contours of space-time and the contours of multiple dimensions that we don't talk about, because all of us, by virtue of our education, are ensconced in space-time. Remember, children are not. They don't talk about all kinds of things that we think is funny and cute until you get to about 7, and then please don't talk about it anymore because then it's strange. Right?
Yeah, right.
And so children are not limited to that kind of idea or that experience. But that is the second mind. It is beyond space-time, and it is experienced as space-time as we get to its localizing aspects.
Okay.
The third mind is prior to the thrill, prior to the experience of light, right? We can say thrill and light are something synonymous. And it is that thrill and light that differentiates, fractalizes, polarizes, diffracts as the kind of crystallizations that we ultimately call objects and things in this very physical world as the first mind. So important to say that the third mind is not practical and does not have practical use in society. And I'm not advocating that we should be exploring the third mind even. I think it's necessary for a complete framework, but I think what we're moving towards is a second mind society where we recognize our potential, where we recognize that we are not only a body, not only a personality, and by virtue of this realization inherently knocks down the walls of the first mind in the form of philosophy, spirituality, religion, science, and the subsequent fear that these walls cause.
Okay. So then would it be sufficient to say that the second mind is the ontological primitive for as far as we should be concerned, or that's enough to take on in this?
I think for all practical purposes,
as
the
primates,
second mind is, we would be another civilization.
Right.
The more we approach the second mind. Yeah.
So as teenage primates, we can just settle with that for now. And I mean, it's fun to wonder, but yeah.
I mean, I think it's second mind is beautiful. You know, it's where life is, you know, and every field is moving towards that. You see it in physics, you see it in biology, you see it in mathematics, you see it in information theory. You can see it in philosophy, you know, in philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, but I've noticed in listening to philosophers, it seems like the more their ideas evolve, they tend to move closer towards idealism, right? It's like, it's just body first. And then, well, maybe I'm a panpsychist, you know, maybe I'll put them side by side, body and mind. And well, what is this mind after all? And, you know, I mean, this is classic and described for millennia, you know, in the Advaita tradition. And non-duality essentially says it doesn't really matter. All of these are basically stages of identity. And the more the identity changes, the philosophy will accordingly change. Yeah.
And for the sake of beyond us, it's their convenient fictions that we draw up for ourselves to describe things, and they are necessary. And I don't say fiction in a derogatory way or trying to be polemic in any sense, but it's sciences, you know, that it's the language we use, and it may not be the truth, but it's what we have, and it's what we have to work with. And
the challenge is in communicating that in a way that's not scary, you know, because as you know, I'm sure you've read a lot about this and reflected on this, and it can sound very detached. It can sound very scary. It can sound like you're asking a person to leave their life behind. And that's why I say, forget all that stuff. We're talking about healing. Like, we're talking about healing, becoming whole, seeing more of ourselves. And that's what healthcare needs.
Yeah, for sure. And another aspect of the work that I know I said I had a narrow bracket, but the other thing I try to do is to rein people in when it comes to matters of spirituality, to say, if you believe in a telos, if you believe in something beyond this, that it makes all the sense in the world that everything we need, everything that we should function with is apparent and it is accessible. And to go and start confabulating or theorizing or whatever you want to call it, anything beyond that is escapism, I think. And so this kind of grounds with what you're saying, that let's be careful about escapism. It feels good. It's like, saying there's a heaven when you die kind of thing. And it just helps this existential treachery be all the more palatable. But I think that's there's a dark side to that, or there is a cost benefit ratio. The benefit is not as good. And so pragmatic, realistic kind of, we're here, let's work together. There's so many things, like you said, health is one of the primary things, physical health. I agree with the Buddha that life is suffering, but I think that and we have to qualify some of that, but I think a lot of the suffering is artificial. A lot of the suffering is made by us, and nature can certainly do things to us. We have tsunamis and earthquakes and tornadoes, oh my, but the bulk of our suffering is what we generate for ourselves. And it's not that we do it on purpose necessarily. It's the programs we're in. It's the systems, that social and cultural systems that we run, the narratives and things like that. This is just me talking, but I just think, I think that is the thing that we can focus on, that we have control over, which is what you're addressing. You can focus on, the four engines that you've talked about, and getting back to some good basic tenets of self-care and proactive living in that sense, with a respect for who we are. So
let me say that, to me, life is many, many things, and suffering is an aspect of it. And I know you see that too. I'm just taking a different angle.
Right.
That I think it's many, many things. And I think, Buddha was specifically coming from, he was seeing only people that are suffering, because that's who goes to the Buddha, right? And so he was validating them by saying life is suffering, and because he had also suffered a great deal. So we all know that suffering is part of life, and there's also much more interspersed and much more potential there. And regarding telos, one of the characteristics of the three minds framework is that telos can be in any direction. I don't speak about the third mind as reality or ultimate reality. Sometimes in a spiritual context, if there's a specific spiritual community that's used to those words, I'll use it. But the first mind is as real as the third mind, right? I don't differentiate between imaginary, reality, hallucination, right? I think it's a matter of usefulness and responsibility, right? I don't think I have the power to tell somebody that isn't real. What you're experiencing is not real. I mean, based on what authority do I say that? Other than my own inability to experience that, right? So I don't think we need words like real, imaginary, hallucination. I think we need words like, is that useful? Does that work for you? Is that the kind of life you want to live? Is that responsible? I think those are more useful questions. The first mind view can be responsible. It can be useful. It is useful. And for where we are now, and same thing for the second mind view, responsible, useful. Third mind view, responsible and useful, doesn't really come into play, but I think that's incredibly freeing, to say telos, but in where's the starting point? Where's the end point? You can reverse the vector in whichever direction works for us as a society. And I think if we take that perspective, I think our inclination will be towards moving into this second mind range of experience, just because there's much more possibility here.
Yeah, for sure. And I look at telos as not being top down or any direction, as you just said. It's if we can even talk about it, then we can generate a sense of localized telos. And I think that's, again, satisficient. I love that word. It works, and it's what we need. So don't try to jettison yourself off to some, greater Godhead thing that has the telos, the Oz with all the sparkling lights and everything like that. I think it's right here, and it's in front of us, and it's what we choose to employ or not to employ day to day. And I think that's where telos should be nested. I think for us, I think it's just a creation process or a relational process that it's part of moving forward. And I love one of your blogs. I think I may not be touching on it appropriately with what you just said, but the enlightenment versus what we call mental health issues. One culture. So in other words, a spiritual relativism needs to be taken into mind that, how do we rein in spiritual experience or enlightenment experience? And I kind of hold to the idea that ultimate enlightenment is not necessary in this life, that it's the ongoing, the unfolding of just being enlightened little by little. And that's why for my work, I love inquiry, because inquiry to me leads to the next answer, the next, not the ultimate answer, but just the next idea that can come up to solve. And when it comes to going back to Buddha for a moment, the idea of awakening, I think for me, awakening is almost a dissociative process. It's almost that you are not so much affected by the affect of the negativity of what goes on in the world, is less penetrating. And so for me, it's very simple, but it shouldn't be overblown, and nothing should be directed or projected onto that too much. Anyway, this is just, again, my self-centric thinking on these kind of things. But I think we have to be careful about that too, because that type of language and that type of thing goes back to what we were saying earlier, where cults can be, start to form over somebody who says, "Oh yeah, I'm awakened, and I'm there," and all that kind of thing. And it's like, well, we have to be very cautious with that kind of thing. But I love what you say, though, that and I've heard others. In fact, I interviewed Sharifa Tekin a couple months ago, and she's a professor at UT San Antonio. And her work she's in the humanities with philosophy, but she's also trying to work with everybody that revolves around the DSM-5 to allow for patient inclusion in the narrative and the construction of perhaps a DSM-6 or the amendments to DSM-5, if that's something that happens. And she's trying to say that, first of all, mental health is, it's culturally relative, and that the inclusion of these people who have the anecdotal sameness, the plural of anecdote kind of thinking, they should be included, and not just these sort of top-down guys that have doctoral degrees in psychiatry and so forth. So yeah, mental health, and I know you touch on that a lot with your YouTube channel and again, this particular blog that I read. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling here, but
you touched on so many huge points. Each one could be an hour conversation. Yeah, let me see if I can just comment on a couple quickly.
Okay.
One is, I see what is called awakening in spiritual circles. I see it as an associative process and not a dissociative process. I see a strictly first mind identity as dissociation, and I see a strictly third mind identity as dissociation. I see the second mind identity as association, where we have access to the local body. We have access to localizing cultural thinking and language. Otherwise, there's no English happening here. And at the same time, there is the range of the deeper second mind and possibly the third mind. So I think that's association. And I think that's one thing that needs to change in our culture, in psychology and psychiatry. There generally is not talk about association, right? We pathologize through dissociation, but that's because our own understanding of identity is that it's first mind. And relative to that, everything is dissociation. So I think we have to change that. Another thing is enlightenment and mental illness. Huge topic, right? So what is mental health and mental illness? If I say, hey, this person has kidney disease, and then this person comes to me and says, well, Dr. Kumar, can you tell me what the kidney is? Like, I don't understand. And I say, well, it's located here in the flank, and it takes in blood and it filters the blood, and then it makes urine and sends the urine to the bladder, and then the rest of the blood, it circulates back into the bloodstream. So, okay. All right. I tell somebody, well, you know what, you have a mental illness. And they say, well, what is the mind? Guess what? Based on my training as a doctor, I cannot answer that question.
Right.
I might do my own personal inquiry or something, but my training as a doctor does not qualify me to answer that question. Then the person with the kidney disease says, okay, that's interesting. Can you tell me where the kidney is? I say, yeah, it's right here. It's located right here. You can touch, right? The person who I say has mental illness says, can you tell me where the mind is? Well, no, actually, I can't do that either. So, doctor, you're telling me I have a mental illness, but you don't know what the mind is and you don't know where the mind is? Yeah. So I'm using this to illustrate a point that I don't think in our society today, we can responsibly use the phrases mental health or mental illness because we don't know enough about the mind. There are a lot of people with good intentions that now say, everything is mental or everyone has mental health. I think this just frankly plays into the ignorance and plays into the stigma that's created by its opposite phrase, mental illness. Many of the things that we call mental illness, I saw growing up in people going through a process of change. And it was seen as range B between ranges A and C, right? But that kind of understanding is not there in our society because we're a first mind society. We're physicalized and we don't understand mind. And so we have to physicalize it in terms of brain and neurotransmitters because that's the only place we're comfortable, and that's what's happening. So I think this whole idea of mental health and mental illness needs to be revisited. And we need to be, especially professionals, if you have any kind of title in front of your name and any kind of public authority, you need to be very careful about throwing these phrases around when we haven't been trained to use them. So that's one comment about that. And by the way, many of those things are states of change, states of transformation, right? When you're going through critical emotional experiences, critical identity changes, critical changes in how we perceive, all of these change so much so fast. And a society that doesn't understand it, it has to be taken as illness so that the rest of us are comfortable, right? Because if that could happen to me, I don't want that to happen to me, right? So there's this whole kind of psychological warfare happening in this phrasing of mental health and mental illness that we need to revisit. And if we do that, many people who do go through this period of suffering and either don't identify with the label of illness or they never encountered it to begin with, they reach another level of functioning. And guess what? We're going to have those people on the podcast too, right? Healing is possible.
Yeah.
And then, and I think you touched on a couple of things that I can't remember.
I rambled. I apologize. I go on tangents sometimes. I do like what you said about awakening being an association process. And to contextualize what I meant by dissociation, it's a minor thing, but dissociating from the malaise of cultural psychic injury, and not being as, the affect doesn't sink as deep. So that's kind of the context of dissociation. But there are cones and paradoxical positionings, juxtapositionings. So maybe it is at once an association in the three mind model, but also just kind of a pulling back or retreating, not intentionally, but just perceptually from the potential to be harmed or negatively to have negative affect to reach you. So anyway, but that was sort of the way
I unfortunately got to run now.
Yeah, I know we did hit that hour-and-a-half mark, but I'll have you back because I want to talk about Michelangelo's Medicine and his Dream, the 2 books that you wrote. I'll have the information for those down below. But yeah, let's just go ahead and if you're game, we'll plan on another conversation in the near future.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you.
I very much appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, YouTube audience. And there will be another segment of this, so not to worry. And meanwhile, like I said, all information will be down below for him. All right. Thank you again, Anoop. And I'll say goodbye to you after we're done with the record here.